Okay, we are picking up with our agenda at the Entitlement Share, and want to welcome to our table former Senator Bob Story and Harold Blattie of Montana Association of Counties. Bob Story is with Montana Taxpayers Association. And then we have Susan Nicosia, is it Nicosia? Yeah, from Columbia Falls, who's a city manager. And then we have Mr. Tim Burton, who's been with us this morning from the Montana League of Cities and Towns. I want to welcome the panel. It's a pretty high power panel, so but you got us right after lunch, so we're going to need all that all that power to keep us engaged. No, not really. So I would just remind everyone again, cell phones off. When you do come to the podium to speak, please give us your name and spell it. And with that, let us begin the panel.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. Bob Story, presently with the Montana Taxpayers Association. Our representation here, I guess, really isn't so much as our representation here isn't so much from the Taxpayers Association perspective, only into the point that, you know, if the Entitlement Share Program gets eroded too much, that generally is a local property tax increase, and so that's really our interest in that. My personal interest in the Entitlement Share Program, as some of you know and some of you don't, is I was the chair of the Special Interim Committee that put this program together, and the chief sponsor of the bill that made it become law. And so I've been involved with it now for 20 years. And the folks with me here, Susan and Harold, were both also on that committee that worked for about 2 years to put this program together, and they'll bring their insights to that also. We have kind of a PowerPoint that I put together a session ago, I think, that just to follow as a outline so that we don't ramble too much, I guess. But the basic purpose of well, I guess I should go back in the history that what brought us to this point. In the late 90s, the legislature did a lot of revisions to the tax system, especially the property tax system. And in doing that, to prevent property tax increases at the local level, they took general fund money and reimbursed local governments and schools for the revenue lost from some major property tax cuts that I think will be listed here somewhere eventually. And those were substantial amounts of money, in the neighborhood of $100 million a year. And also, about that same time, the Department of Revenue had some pretty big concerns about some of the other revenue streams and the complications with them, and the accounting of money in them, especially motor vehicles. And so they looked at this as an opportunity to do some simplification. So there were two main purposes of this whole project, and one was to basically institutionalize the reimbursements so that local governments could count on them over a period of time. Previous to that, when especially business equipment taxes had been reduced from 12 to 9% and later from 9 to 6%, those reimbursements were phased out over a 10-year period. The theory being that you lower the tax rate, you generate more business equipment, and so over a period of time, local governments and schools would be made whole as the tax base grew. But by the time we went in 99 and reduced the rate from 6 to 3%, that bill had a clause in it that said if certain criteria were met in economic growth, the business equipment tax would go away. Well, then you could never grow back out of that at the local government level, and so the state put a reimbursement plan together to provide some general fund money, because that was a policy decision made by the legislature. It wasn't anything that local governments came and asked to have done. So the second part of the purpose was to simplify the revenue exchanges between state and local governments. And you may or may not have a handout, I think, that Mr. Blattie put together that shows you how the motor vehicle revenues moved around between local governments, the state, back to local governments, and so forth. And it was a fairly complex and probably not real good distribution method. It just one of those things that got built up over years and years. Harold.
The handout, this is the cover page of it, and the 2 pages that are attached show the flow of motor vehicle registration money prior to House Bill 124. And as you can see, there were numerous transactions, numerous opportunities for mistakes to be made. And the county treasurer had a significant role in making sure that all of those allocations were done properly. The second page of that shows the simplified revenue stream. All of the motor vehicle money became a part of the base amount of the entitlement share, and that'll be something I can come back to in a bit.
Now, if you look at that, you can just see how complex that distribution system had gotten to be, and anecdotally, one of the things that would happen was if a local treasurer made an error one year, they usually corrected it themselves the next year. So they might have sent too much money one year, and they just held back the next year. They sent too much, didn't send enough the first year. Anyway, it just, as Harold said, made a lot of room for ambiguity in the revenue streams. So in '99, here's what the legislature did. It made some major tax reductions. They reduced and a lot of this had to do with things that were going on at the federal level, whether it had to be the deregulation of the telecommunications industry, whether the potential deregulation of the electrical industry, kind of a historic reduction in business equipment taxes. As I said, there were 2 reductions prior to that, and this just continued that on, and then phased out the livestock, ad valorem tax on livestock also. So those had some big impacts on electrical generation, especially on certain districts. Cascade County, Rosebud County had a lot of electrical generation. Telecom property was spread pretty far and wide, but this was the beginning of the cell phone revolution, and we're trying to keep the tax rate reasonable on these the historic telecom properties, so that at least you could generate investment there. Anyway, the state reimbursed all these cuts, as I said, $76 million roughly speaking, and the point was to not have that a phased out reimbursement, and also have it put in place so that if the legislature would have a little more difficulty in rolling that money back into the state treasury.
Robert, if I could, I think it's really important to understand that if there isn't a reimbursement to local governments for that lost property tax base that mills are levied against, it becomes a tax shift to all other classes of property. And there was legislation in the past where that took place, and the legislators could go home and say, we reduced this particular class of property, the rate on it, and really not, I don't think, understand the effect of the shift to all other classes of property that weren't beneficially treated.
This was like a rifle approach to reimbursement. If you lost $1 in tax revenue from a tax reduction, you got that dollar back in reimbursement. And this went on not only in cities, counties, but it also went on in the schools. There was a block grant program for schools that pretty much met the end of its run last session, but it had been reduced a couple times prior to that. And when you do that, especially in school funding, they took the money and they put it back in schools, but they put it back through the distribution formula. So most of those reimbursement dollars ended up in places other than where the tax reductions were. because they followed the kids. So you took a lot of money out of Cascade County and a lot of money out of Rosebud County and spread that across the whole state. It more of a shotgun approach to reimbursement then, and that being what it is, but that's what happened. They were meant to be ongoing. As I said, the earlier ones were phased out, and as Harold said, it was mainly meant to prevent a property tax shift, because you weren't reducing anybody's obligation, any local government or school's obligation to provide services, so they were going to have to pay for those services one way or the other, and if they didn't get it from their old tax base, they were going to get it from their new tax base, which basically meant mill levy increases to everyone that was left paying taxes. The simplification thing was a little more complex. There were a lot of different areas of money where the state collected money, the counties collected money. It moved back and forth, but the whole point was to simplify that, and the simplest way to simplify it was you just rolled all that money into the general fund, and whatever money any local government gave up that particular year, they got back the next year, and then that was their base, and then they basically got a growth factor applied to that. So as the revenue streams that they were dependent on had historic growth to them, that was supposed to be the growth factor that applied to their reimbursement. So cities had a growth factor, counties had a growth factor, schools had a growth factor, because they all had different mixes of money that came to them. You know, most of the school money, other than equipment reimbursements, were vehicle money. Most of the city money was vehicle money and gaming, and the county money was vehicle money and whatever. Liquor, yeah.
Robert, you have two sheets that look like this. They're orange, and one of them in the top left-hand corner says county, it says Stillwater, and the other one says Rosebud. I did the one for Stillwater County. I was a commissioner in Stillwater at the time. The other one Representative Custer did, so she might find some of that familiar. And in her former life as a clerk and recorder. But, you know, the headings are self-explanatory as to the monies that went into the base amount of the entitlement share.
So that was one of the questions from the committee. How did the legislature maintain balance between the previous system and the new system? These numbers were audited and they were provided. So if my city or his county or your county received this amount of money from this source in the 2000 fiscal year, along with the reimbursement, the property tax reimbursement, then that was the amount that was set to be reimbursed to each city and county. So it was based, because remember, these were our local government revenues. These were our revenues that were coming to us, including with the policy decision of the legislature to use other income sources to reduce property taxes. It was instrumental of the 1999 legislature to recognize that sweeping, in fact, that was the headline in the Missoulian, the sweeping tax reform. But with that, they also knew that was going to shift the taxes. That was going to shift the taxes, that somehow we had to make up utility and industrial. There were some cuts to railroad as well, and all of those, that the growth was going to take some time to get there. So this was a very equitable system that was put into place. And as the committee, as we worked on it painstakingly over those 2 years, to come up with this, it was obvious that we needed to bundle it together, that the revenues that passed back and forth from the state to the counties and the cities, and county to the city and the city to the state, let's roll this together. But with this program, I think sometime, well, one, I did disagree with the name, state entitlement, because obviously it's a bullet now, right? It's a bullet for the legislature and the finance office and budget directors and governors to look at this large number and say, you know, if we cut this, why are we giving them this money? Well, it was our money. And if you don't give us this money and I lose a third of the revenue source for my $3 million general fund budget, I can't make that revenue up someplace else. So how do we provide the services? But this program, and that's why it was a 3,000-page bill, state entitlement really can't be unbundled from the 1510-420 provisions. I mean, we literally rewrote Title VII and major sections of Title 15. Because then with entitlement and with the levy at the time, with the property tax revenue, we loosened up some provisions for counties primarily. Cities already had a general all-purpose levy, but counties still had, you will levy 2 mills for weeds and 4 mills for this. And so with this program, though, it was how do we also look at the property tax revenue? How do we allow for growth? So it was a major project to look at and to work with the legislature to allow for the growth factor in entitlement, but then also an inflation factor for our property tax, which this year was 1.02%. That was $10,000 to my city. And then with that came the calculation of what do we get to do for growth, right? Because that's part of it. Your community grows, you actually do see some growth, but how do you provide that same level of service? So with that calculation, though, came the newly taxable property. This year, we had 7 million, the equivalent of 7 million in newly taxable property that gave our city $23,000. So our 1510-420 property tax, we got to raise, I can do that math, $33,000 of new revenue. Now, yes, our value went up, so our mills went down. That's all part of that calculation. But they were part and parcel together. They're woven together. The entitlement program and how we calculated taxes from that time on was a huge component for our committee and for our work. So there's a big promise in here, right, that here's our revenues. One of the questions that we get asked is, why did you choose this system? Well, we chose this system because it was very straightforward and equitable. Here's the revenues. It did simplify things. I know in the scheme of government, it might not look like it now, but even at the Department of Revenue, Department of Transportation, the treasurer's offices, and within city offices, we were no longer moving nickels and dimes around, and it made it very straightforward. Unfortunately, it also made it really straightforward to say, look at this big number, and how can we access that number, and how do we get some of that back? How do we reduce it? But reducing that number now, or pulling some of that revenue back, means that there is no shift to our property taxpayers to make that up, right? Because that's not how the taxing formula. So when we talk about entitlement, it has to be bundled in with how our property taxes are calculated.
So this slide just shows you some of the money that was out there in 2001 that the state already collected, but basically just collected and returned to local governments. The gaming revenue, the alcohol taxes. There was a financial institution tax, which was a bank tax that kind of was in lieu of property taxes. And then there were some counties that, if you were a county that had over 6% state land, you also got a state payment in lieu of tax. And there are, I don't know, a dozen counties or so that were like, the largest being Daniels, which you've probably all heard about. Daniels County is 23% state land. And so state PILT payment to them was a big deal. That came to light about 2 sessions ago when the legislature decided that they needed to take the school block grants back, and so that really left the Scobie School District in the lurch because they lost basically their entitlement money. It was called the block grant. And nobody could figure out why they got so much. Well, it was because that PILT program payment was rolled into the entitlement share, and so they basically lost all the state reimbursement for the public lands the state owned in Daniels County. They got I think, a 2-year reprieve on that, but they don't get it anymore. So there's a couple other counties, Beaverhead and Shoto, that have a fair amount of state land also. But most counties are around 6% state land because it has to do with 36 sections in a township, and 2 of those sections by in the Federal Enabling Act were for the support of schools. So it's 2/36 of your property is state land in most counties. The big issue, as said, was motor vehicle fees and taxes and court fees that the counties collected, and they kept some. They sent some to the state. They sent some to the schools. They sent some to all the miscellaneous districts. It was a pretty complex formula, as the chart that Harold showed you was, and it's starting to get complex again because every time the legislature meets, they change things and they kind of get away from this concept. But the whole point of this is other than the reimbursement for tax cuts, all this revenue was collected by the state and always given to local governments. Those revenue sources there were money that the state collected and sent right back to the local governments anyway. So it wasn't, it was always general fund money that was sent back out. Don't need to spend much time on this, I guess. It just basically put a lot of money in the general fund and created the Entitlement Share Program, which has held together pretty well for 20 years. The schools have been phased out of it over the last 2 or 3 sessions, and now the discussion, as you remember from last session, has to do with some of the programs that the state assumed and whether they should be going back to the counties and try to recoup some money to help the state pay for what are now state programs. They're state programs. They're no longer local programs, and they're owned by the state, run by the state. And that's the way it works. These are, the components of the entitlement share. The big thing being most of them were state money flowing back to the local governments all the time, except for the reimbursements, which were created to cover the policy decisions made by the legislature. So again, some of the collection processes are still the same. It's just the money, it comes to Helen and then goes back. And the counties distribute that entitlement share program down to the subdivisions, to the schools, to the cities, to the schools, the miscellaneous districts, and so on. I think the state cuts a check to the cities probably. Is that right, Susan?
It's wired in now.
Yeah.
We've gone paperless.
Oh. So as Susan talked about, all these revenue streams had a growth factor. There were always more motor vehicles every year. They were worth more money. Their taxes that you paid on them up until about 2000 were based on the value of the vehicle. They were an ad valorem tax. Then the legislature put a referendum on the ballot in 2000 to go to the flat tax system that we have now, and so now small light vehicles are on a flat tax. They're so much if it's 1 to 5 years old, and 5 to 10, and then after 10 they're a different rate. There's been a few fees added since then by the legislature to generate some more money for the general fund. It doesn't go back downhill because everything local governments get is based on what they had in 2000. So, the eastern Montana counties were pretty happy with the entitlement program during the early part of the century, and then when the oil boom came, then they didn't get the extra money from all the extra vehicles that showed up. But during the bad times, they didn't see the downturn either because of the, gaming revenues being lower and vehicle numbers being lower and things like that. So it actually stabilized a lot of the rural Montana through a tough time, and some of the, Bozeman was never really a big fan of the whole program because they knew they were going to grow and they didn't think the growth factor would keep up with their natural growth. But it's the growth factor is a complex thing, and I can't explain it. The Department of Revenue calculates that, and it really has a couple different components to it that depends on your growth in population and that.
I will add that the county's growth factor was slightly different because they also got to keep the mills for the assumed, for the expenditures that the state assumed for welfare and district court.
Yes, so I hope this is the appropriate time. I think it's really important.
Harold, can you talk into the mic,
I
please?
think it's really important to know that there were three major bills passed in that session. House Bill 124, and which is what created the entitlement share. It did a number of other things, but also Senate Bill 339, which was the state assumption of welfare programs. There were 9 counties, I believe it was, in Montana that it was simply impossible for them to fund their ongoing welfare. And the state had assumed those counties in the past. So the county would levy 9 mills, and just whatever that brought in, they would send to the state, and then the state would pay for those services. The other was the state assumption of district courts. And with that also went all of the fees that the counties had collected, and the fines and forfeitures, and that was formerly county money that then now became state money. So from this base that was created here, this was the revenues that went into the base. The 2001 actual costs for district court or welfare or the 9 mills, if it was an assumed county, was subtracted from this. And that's what the actual payment, beginning payment, was based upon. As Robert had mentioned, the motor vehicle was a component in there, and because of the timing of the initiative to put motor vehicles on a flat fee, there was an adjustment, and every one of the counties, the factor was just a little bit different. I'm not even going to begin to suggest that I understand what magic went on down the hall here in calculating that for each county, but that was a component of, but the state assumption of those 2 programs was part and parcel of this whole thing. House Bill 124 was the vehicle that took care of the money. The policy decisions were in the other bills, but the money was handled in House Bill 124.
The report also recognized that the growth factor would be reviewed, which we did a few years ago. The first time it was reviewed was at about the 10-year mark. I can't thank the legislature enough for creating this committee, because in order to really look at the issue, I don't see how it can have any justice during the legislative session. I think the nickname of the sausage maker for the legislative session is very accurate, that in order to really look at all of these factors and all of these numbers that come forward, in order to really look at the data and where it came from, and you use these 3 years of calculation and how you get it, I think it is important that we review it. I also think that the spreadsheets from Department of Revenue, and they're doing their job, they're saying this is where the revenues are and this is how much we put into the entitlement. But these spreadsheets, these numbers aren't intended to show that the program's making money or losing money. It doesn't really reflect a financial position. It's only reflecting the data. Here was the revenues. Here are vehicle taxes. Here's video gambling revenues. It doesn't reflect the $76 to $100 million payback, right? That was part of the legislative budget. That's House Bill 2. So that's not necessarily reflected here. The fact that the first couple of years a program looked like it was positive is kind of lends itself to the larger cities and counties that said our revenues would have been growing at a faster rate. You sold us out, but we didn't sell it out. Right? This was, and I call it a handshake. When I come, we shook hands. We agreed on this program, and with it, then it was originally a statutory appropriation that this can't be pierced, right? It can't, your money is safe. You have a handshake, you have a statute that says, here's your entitlement share. It was pierced, and I hope through this committee, I'd kind of like to see a bubble around it again, right? I want to protect it. I'm like a parent. My name is on that. It has been 20 years. Government changes things slowly. Sometimes they change things too quickly. But we still need to protect this program. And we never would have guessed. We certainly didn't discuss that there could potentially be a bill introduced that would, and I'm going to pick on the county mental health, that the bill basically said, if this isn't in House Bill 2, we're going to take it out of this entitlement share in 15-1-121. Boy, I wish I could do that. I wish I could adopt a budget that says if this is not in the city's general fund budget, Flathead County's going to pay it, right? But there isn't any provision in statute for me to do that. I think it's important. My ask of this committee is, how do we come back? We have the history. The history is important, and I appreciate the opportunity, one committee meeting at a time, to educate legislators and new department folks. Term limits has not been kind to this program, as many others. I understand that. Nor have retirement, because when you look at data and you want to know, how did we get here? Well, I appreciate being able to tell you how we got here. I am just as concerned as how do we move forward. And again, it comes back to this committee and how much time do we have? How do we put the bubble back around it? How do we protect the 2001 handshake, and how do we move forward? Obviously, we have to look at the growth factor as we move. Are these revenues growing at this rate? Does the state budget support these numbers? But I'm very cautious with, don't look at this to determine whether or not it's making or losing money, because you'd have to add in the backfill on the tax revenue. But from my perspective, other than a few holes that somehow got in, it is working the way it's supposed to. For cities and counties, we get quarterly revenues, right? And they're stable, and they're not volatile, and they're not political. One of the biggest chunks of money for cities was video gambling, which was tied to the Department of Revenue, to the alcohol permits. We didn't create that, but I can tell you in the early 2000s that whenever a casino wanted to come in, local governments were accused of encouraging gambling to line our pockets. After the entitlement program, you didn't hear that. And I don't believe you heard it at the legislative level either, that you were encouraging gambling, you were pushing revenues, you were trying to line your pockets. So there was a lot of give and take in this process. But I'm really concerned about how it moves forward, and particularly at how easily the school block grant money was diverted. And we have, I call them attacks. I tell my city council and mayor, I have to come to Helena and fight for the state entitlement program. And I'm more than willing to come and fight for it because my name's on it, because I believed in it, and I think that the system can work. I just want to make sure there's not holes, and that the message is that these are local government revenues, and we had a partnership. And when there's a policy decision that affects these revenues, and I'll pick on the OPD, the let's take some of this money because it's obviously the cities and counties that created this. The spreadsheet that I saw would have taken away $21,000 for my little city. My increase in entitlement this year was $25,000. I don't know what the $21,000 exactly is based on, because that was more than some of the small counties. And cities do minor, little misdemeanors. we had, out of 1,100 citations, we had, that the prosecutor has to look at, there were 7 bench trials and 1 jury trial in the year. So you need to pony up some more money. Well, I don't know, I'd be looking at that budget. And I know that we need to talk about that, because that's one of those, you're piercing this and you're gonna pull money out. But is that really what should happen? Because we don't have a say in how it's funded, how it's budgeted, what level of service. But it will affect our ability to provide a level of service. And then with the other mechanism, we don't have a way to make up that lost revenue.
Mm-hmm.
We are at our maximum tax.
I would just add, this is the executive summary of the Local Government Funding and Structure Committee, Simplification in the 21st Century. This is the executive summary. And I would say that I wasn't sitting on the committee with these 3 fine folks, but I was a young city manager in Helena, and Senator Bob Story carried House Bill 124, which is this. And that's why we call it the big bill. And it was comprehensive. It was well thought through at both the state, city, towns, and county level. 20 years has passed, and it has worked as a stable funding source. And really what it did was a couple things like Mr. Story pointed out. It backfilled tax cuts that were policy decisions at the state, and it created a more effective way to collect existing general fund taxes and redistribute it out to the local governments. Those are the 2 major gains which simplified everybody's life. What I really want you to know, and it's already been said, but that these were always general fund dollars that went to local government. Today, that entitlement distribution goes right into our general fund. 1510 420 in property taxes off to the side. So when we get the growth rate cut, or we get money reallocated out of the entitlement share, then that comes right out of the local government general fund, not to be backfilled. And what do we fund first out of the local government general fund? When cities, mayors, and council people sit down every year, they're going to fund the police department, the fire department, the city administration functions, and then what is left over may get some park and rec allocations. So really, it makes it very difficult for us to maintain public safety services when the entitlement share is cut. The other conversations that become difficult is when we trued up all this revenue through accounting and said, okay, that's the fair deal. The state gets this, and we'll redistribute it back to you at this level, and we'll add in the effect that these tax cut policies would have to make you whole. Since that time, a lot of policy decisions have taken place at the state level. Permanent license plates on vehicles, for instance, which reduces state revenues. A lot of decisions in terms of the Office of Public Defender in terms of increasing cost. And now, particularly last session and the session before, we're in discussions where here's the percent you paid back in 2000. Now you're paying a less percent. We need to take the entitlement share to fill the gap, when in fact those policy decisions didn't involve us. But that's the difficulty of term limits. It's the difficulty of time. But then that's a direct cut to our general fund, and a challenge to fund public health and safety services. So I think it's important that we understand that this isn't a revenue sharing program. This was to clean up the tax structure and how it's collected, how it's distributed, and for significant policy tax decisions that were made here, It was, let's make the local governments whole so that they don't raise property on houses and residential and commercial businesses. There were some recommendations out of this, obviously the big bill, and that was a major coming together to pass something like this through the House and the Senate and get the governor to sign it. It was work well done. People identified the problem, they defined the problem, they looked at the options, they picked the solutions, and then they implemented, monitored, and adjusted. So with that being said, I think that knowing that it's not a revenue sharing program, but we're perfectly willing to talk about what is the growth rate now? Is this working or not working for local government? Rather than getting into discussions that you used to pay 12% of the Office of Public Defender, there's a whole bunch of decisions that have taken place within that organization. And there have been tax cuts through motor vehicle and other arenas, and now you're only paying, and the cost is increasing exponentially. So your historical 12%, which was part of the discussion in the beginning and then the deal was done, is now, let's say for the sake of conversation, 6%. So we really want you to pick up the additional 6%, which then would come out of our police and fire departments. And the state, the policymakers should have the ability and do have the ability to make those policy decisions. But if it's going to affect our general fund revenues, we should also be a part of that discussion up front rather than 1, 2, or 3 sessions down the road.
I want to run through the rest, and then I think it'd be better if we just had a discussion here as opposed to you guys listening to us yak all the time. So these are some of the most recent changes to the entitlement program was set up to deal with adjustments, as Mr. Burton said. So when the legislature in 2011 and 2013 decided that they wanted to reduce business equipment taxes more, then they had a vehicle to put that money back into the local governments and schools so that, again, you wouldn't have to increase the mill levies, increase property taxes to pay for a decision that was made by the legislature in Helena. The times got tough a couple times and the growth factors were suspended and they were reduced. And those were kind of ad hoc decisions that were made in the legislature during the session. They weren't done in an interim where you could sit down with the folks who were involved and have a discussion and come to a reasoned number about how that should happen.
Excuse me, Mr. Story, Representative Dunwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair and panel. I'm really trying hard to track here. So I just want to clarify, if I may, Madam Chair, the recent changes that were made, all of this, there was no backfill made to balance the imbalance.
There were with the business equipment reductions. There was that additional money put in, wherever that equipment was. They got more money in both 11 and 13 to deal with that. The growth factors weren't. And the block grant, the whole block grant issue was dealt with basically in the legislative process, and the schools were really even involved in that discussion. And they may have been split on how they liked that, because some were winners and some were losers when you roll those block grants up. Because you took money out of, as I said earlier, out of districts that got a lot of block grant money and maybe didn't have a lot of kids, and moved it to districts that had a lot of kids and maybe not a lot of block grant money. Because we tried, when we did the bill, to put the school money back through the existing formulas, either through guaranteed tax base or through direct state aid. But the problem with either of those is the money didn't go back to where the tax reductions were. The money went to where the kids were, and lots of times that wasn't where the property was. So we couldn't grasp that. We couldn't get it worked out when we did that. So we just created the block grants, who many people thought probably wouldn't stand the court test because it wasn't equal distribution of state money as is required. But nobody complained. So it worked. It worked for 10 or 15 years that way. It was the legislature that decided that and it really had more to do, I believe, with not equalizing the distribution of money. It was, how do we fund our share of the state without raising local property taxes or raising state taxes or taking money from one program and giving it to another. We'll just take it from this school district and give it to that school district and let these guys raise their property taxes up so that they're made whole. And that's really what these folks are trying to say is, the legislature is getting in the mindset that this is money out there that they can attach and use to fund state programs and let the locals fund their own programs with a different source of revenue, which is the only one they have is property taxes.
So you've got still more presentation to go through?
That's it.
Okay. So then we are at the, go ahead, but then we'll have the committee get some opportunity to ask questions of clarification or, there's a lot packed into this that we need to understand better, so.
You have one person left in the legislature who was here in 2001 when this passed, and he's sitting right there.
I think it's really important, and Bob mentioned he used the word de-earmarking. And when you look on these revenue matrix, you'll see all of these different revenues. They were split differently, and by statute. There were local government money, but some had to go to roads, some to public safety, some to this program, some to, and the mill levies were limited, as Susan mentioned. A county's maximum levy for welfare was 9 mills, district court was 9 mills, road was either 18 or 20, depending on the taxable value of the county. Bridges were 8. And the legislature, in effect, made the decision. It said, why are we muddling around telling you where to spend your money? I-105 put a property tax limit in place. And so as the legislature, we're going to tell you what your maximum that you can levy for countywide levies, but we're not going to tell you where to spend it. And so that freed that up and de-earmarked that. So counties in the entitlement share payment receive that as quarterly payments. The only obligation that a county has is to make special districts whole, because special district money was collected in here too. So counties have an allocation that goes to each of the special districts that was in existence at the time, but then they can use the entitlement share dollars as they choose. If they want to put it all in the general fund, they can do that. If they want to apportion it out to the fair fund and the library fund and all of the other various funds, they can do that, and most of them do. Most of them do that, certainly that split. I don't know any that keeps it whole, but that was a significant thing that took place a little bit kind of behind the scenes, was the legislature saying, why are we meddling around with how you spend your money? We're going to tell you how much is the maximum you can spend, and that's under 1510 420 and the allowable float, but then you decide how you're going to spend it. And so that was, I think, one of the most significant policy decisions that was made in here, and certainly one of the most welcome.
Okay. Members of the committee, there's been a lot shared here, and I'm wondering if you have any questions before we go to public comment, and then there'll be questions after public comment. So Representative Fern, and then we'll get to Senator Ellsworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to beat Senator Ellsworth to the punch, So, Madam Chair, I'll ask Susan Nicosia a question. You used the term pierced as if going from that base year of 2001 up to present, over that time period, various elements, pierced, I mean probably taken away, and then Mr. Story reviewed 3 elements. So when you say pierced, and when Mr. Story shows those three elements, are we saying the same thing, or do you have other things in mind historically that have slowly been removed from the legislature? And I'll finish off by saying I think it would be helpful, we'll spend a lot of time with this, of trying to figure out or seeing this illustrated some way of what exactly has been pierced. And then I'll ask one follow-up.
Madam Chairman, Representative Fern, the slide does not depict all of the piercing.
I feared
And
not.
yes, I use that as money was taken out.
Right.
And I'm sure that Mr. Blattie has the bill number for the mental health that was in the 2017 session or 15, where 17 session. They all kind of rolled together after a while. So, but that was and very similar to the OPD proposal to you're not paying enough, let's just take it out of this share before it goes back to the local government. Because even our growth factor is adjusted mid-legislative session and I consider that a piercing, that if we're relying on a 2% or 3% growth that's embodied in the statute, and then that gets pierced during the legislative session, those are real dollars. Those are real dollars to us that we have to figure out how to make them up. But so it's a combination of adjustments to growth factors and then pulling money out of the entitlement share before it comes to us. I embody all of that into piercing our funds and using them elsewhere.
And just as one quick follow-up, Madam Chair, I guess you've kind of touched on this, Susan, as far as the growth factor goes, but there seems to be amongst all of you a sort of relaying sort of a secretive nature among the complexities deep in the Department of Revenue of how this growth factor works. And I think it would be helpful eventually for this committee. I don't think we have to understand how it works, but at least see what these numbers are and historically how they've worked and what logic there is. And reflect a bit on the base year of whatever it is, 2000, 2001, and at some point see how far we've gone afar from that, to try to figure out clearly what the problem is in dollars and cents. So, and I guess the last thing is the whole 15, 10, 420, and that I sense that if we reluctant to move the cap on 15, 10, 420, and we keep on slowly piercing the entitlements, that's why we're here today. So,
If I might, Madam Chair, could I maybe respond to you?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So House Bill 124 in the entitlement share was intended to be a vehicle to facilitate policy changes made by the legislature. So an example was this state assumption of public defender program. There was a reduction in the entitlement share. That's fair. When the legislature increased or decreased the rate on business equipment, there was an increase to the entitlement share. That's fair. That's working just exactly as it was intended to. What I believe that Susan is talking about is when, during executive action on a bill at the last minute with no public comment, an amendment is done that steals, and I'll use the word steals, entitlement share dollars to fund, it was House Bill 33, to fund mental health. That's not the way it was intended to work. I would also add that when the legislature has chosen to freeze the entitlement share growth, freeze it for a biennium, that is not only taking away the growth dollars, but it's taking away the growth of the growth dollars forever. So that amount that was lost keeps exponentially increasing over time. And so when there is the legislature actually makes a reduction, That's dollars that are not only lost then, but they're lost forever, and the growth is lost forever. The growth factor isn't that complicated. It originally was based upon the, I believe it was a gross state product, a combination, and the legislature a few sessions ago changed it and tied it to specific general fund revenues. And that was one of the very early original intents of the whole thing of House Bill 124, is to allow local governments to participate in the revenue fortunes or failures of the general fund. We agreed to that. That concept was presented to us, and I know that at the time Alec Hansen was the executive director of the League in Towns, and we sat down and we looked through it, and we could see, well, okay, we're going to get hurt for a while, but we can see in the out years it probably will end up being more beneficial. But it really was, I think, tying it to what the original intent was, to participate in the fortunes, if you will, of the general fund.
I think one other thing on the growth factor was that it created, the growth factor is really a pool of money. And that pool of money by statute is divided two ways. Part of it is distributed on population, and part of it's distributed on the base. So it was made to adjust. If you were a growing city, you'd end up with a little bit a bump because of that. I don't know how it ever worked with, if you were a city growing into the county and the county was getting smaller and the city was getting bigger, how that trade-off happened. But that's why I say that's all over in the Department of Revenue that does that calculation.
And while the overall growth factor is statutorily set or determined by formula, each jurisdiction's growth factor ends up being a bit different because of how the allocation is done and their contribution to the base amount. And this spreadsheet is posted on the MACO website if you want to look at the history of it from 2004 forward.
Madam Chair, there is some mystery to those calculations.
Okay, we'll go to Senator Ellsworth.
Yes, I do like to interject myself now and again. So, Mr. Story, this is actually, Madam Chair, this is Mr. Story. So, hindsight's a beautiful thing. And looking at the legislation that you passed, do you believe that there's actually a potential to, and I understand what you're talking about by piercing it, so I get that. So is the legislation so perfect that it shouldn't be played with and that it shouldn't be adjusted? Or with hindsight, is there legislation that potentially could make that better? Because that's the big question.
Well, thank you, Senator. And as a legislator, never apologize for asking questions, because I find too many legislators don't ask enough questions to be well informed. So I'll tell you, and they used to tell me to shut up after a while because I'd ask questions. But all right, is the bill perfect? No. No bill is. Can it be improved? Probably, but marginally. The question is, how should it be? How should it be modified? Should it be modified at the 11th hour in executive session of a committee, or should it be modified through 2 years of discussion in front of this committee? And I think that's what we're telling you as a group, that this committee needs to take ownership of this program. If you want to modify it, but bring the players to the table that are involved, have that discussion, have a well-thought-out plan to modify it, and then take that forward. And if someone tries to do the end run around it, be the ones that say, no, slow that down. It maybe needs to be done, but do it the right way. I think that would be my suggestion it was complex. It wasn't easy to pass. But because most people didn't understand what was in the bill. You know, you've been there long enough, all of you, to know that if somebody brings in a bill the size Mr. Burton has, its chances of passing are slim and none, because there's too many ways it can be, holes can be found in it. I'll tell you, we passed this bill on a philosophy concept. We will guarantee the bill's mechanically sound. And it was. This is just a philosophy. As you as the legislator, can you support the philosophy that we're trying to do here of keeping the reimbursements whole, simplifying the process, freeing up local governments to spend their money how they choose to spend it? That concept sold to the legislature. You know, the mechanics of the bill have been adjusted, as everyone here said, never through an organized process. Always pretty much ad hoc by some bill coming in front of a finance committee or an appropriations committee who have not sat on the policy side of the issue.
Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator, I'd also like to add to what Mr. Story just stated, in that we would love this committee to own this discussion and this policy moving forward. And I just want to point out that one of the recommendations in this study from 1999 was to create a local government interim committee. We were able to achieve that last session and now have a permanent committee. And it wasn't always a top priority for us either, but it did take a number of years to be sitting here today in front of a committee that was recommended to be created back in 1999.
That's 20 years. And I have a follow-up question too. So I guess what I would like to have one of you do, maybe Mr. Blattie, is walk through for us on a more granular level how that, was it House Bill 33, what happened in executive action and how specifically did it pierce the understanding? Because I've heard it referenced, but I don't quite understand in detail how that unfolded and what the implications were and how it violated that philosophy that we had just heard articulated, I thought, very concisely.
Madam Chair, without naming names, I'm really tempted to, since, but there was a ongoing dispute between a few counties, a handful of counties, over mental health funding. There, years before, was a nursing home bed tax put in place that was used to leverage federal dollars. And some of the local folks got the bright idea they could probably spend those dollars better at home. So they weren't really forthcoming, and I'm saying a small handful, in remitting the money to the state. And so House Bill 33, what it did is it effectively just swept all of that, took the dollars that were needed to fund that reimbursement program, and interestingly enough, also took it from cities and counties. And I have to quip that, well, geez, that partly didn't hurt my feelings all that bad, because before, cities weren't responsible for mental health funding. But it was how it was done. And you saw some of the same things in subsequent sessions. That was my first taste of things happening like that. Just at the 11th hour, and as Mr. Story said, without vetting, without having the parties that are affected having the opportunity to participate in a decision, whether they like the answer or not. But there wasn't any opportunity to participate in it.
So that, just so it can be clear, there was a nursing home bed tax, which not every county or city necessarily had a nursing home, but that money was taken and swept into the general fund without any expansion then of the formula.
And Madam Chair, at that time, that legislative session, Senator Esp was actually assisting the Montana Association of Counties, and he was, I assigned him to that whole ball of wax. I can assure you, he can answer your question
Okay.
much, much better than I can.
I guess I'll be buying him a Pepsi or something and figure
Madam
that out.
Chair, I would like to add that that was a county expenditure, right? County mental health. And then on the application side, it's pretty easy in a bill to say, if it's not in House Bill 2, take it out of the state entitlement share. But on the application side, then because cities have a larger percentage of the pool, when the Department of Revenue, or is that who would have taken it out? Whichever state department then said, okay, we take this out of this state entitlement, the largest share of a county program came out of cities. Because of the method they use in their spreadsheet. So when cities pointed out that we shouldn't have had, take it out of the county pot of money, it shouldn't have come out of our pot, that was never corrected. Because of the method, then they have a Department of Revenue has a spreadsheet, here's the pluses and minuses. So while we are very polite to one another and we've never come to fisticuffs, the city shouldn't have paid for a county program, but it's just the mechanism of the entitlement.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Burton, and then Senator Esp also has his hand up.
I would
And then I
just-
see the queue is forming, so I've got you down. And then I want to just quickly ask, because we have 20 minutes left on this section, how many people in the room are going to be giving public comment? Would you raise your hands if you're planning to? Oh, okay. So that allows us to have a little more back and forth up here. So, Mr. Burton, and then we'll get to Senator Aspen on through the queue.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to add a little context to what Ms. Nicosia had talked about. And it's not that cities don't pay for mental health services. City residents, city property taxpayers within city pay the county health levy. And so, when Mr. Blattie says the 11th hour, it was either the second or the last night of the legislative session where this was done in executive session. We found out about it the next morning, and you can create public policy that way, but it's usually not the best way to make informed decisions.
Okay. Senator Esp.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I was going to suggest that maybe we ask staff to prepare a kind of a flow chart about what happened that night in that bill, and then it would be easier for us to see. The other thing I was thinking that if we look at this further sometime is to look at the 1510-420 and the original intent to allow counties flexibility within their caps and to say there were certain limited levies that you could levy without a vote, but if you wanted to levy any additional levies, you'd have to go to a vote of the people. That has been pierced slightly too, and we might go into some of that discussion too later on in the biennium maybe here.
Thank you. Good suggestion. Is that something that you could follow through? Thank you. I had Representative Sheldon Galloway had her hand up, and then I had Representative Dunwell. Is anyone else? And then Senator Malik. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I like simple things, so big question here. What if property tax was 100% given to the counties and the cities? How's that different than this bill? And would the state of Montana really be hurting if we gave everything to the counties and cities, including, or all property tax would go to counties, cities, and schools?
Madam Chairman, Representative Sheldon Galloway, in effect, that already happens. I mean, the state collects 95 mills, if you discount the 6 mills to the university system. The state collects 95 mills, and they basically roll that back into the school funding formula, and that goes back to schools anyway. So, if you if the state gave up that 95 mills, that's $300 million a year, that they would have to come up with out of some other source to put into schools. So you could take all the entitlement money and fund schools with it and give the 95 mills to the cities and counties. The problem being is the shift regionally. You know, you'd have really big tax increases in some places and not much in others, and then your whole school funding formula would be more dependent upon the general fund stream of revenue, which is all, you know, basically income tax, natural resource taxes. You know, the property tax is a stable source of revenue for the state also. So, I mean, you could mess around with things and adjust things and get dollars to come out even in the state general fund, but the effect at the local level, I mean, that would be a spreadsheet to see. I mean, it would be different. I mean, it wouldn't be a dollar for dollar fix.
Follow-up? Okay, so I was talking with Utah state legislators, and in Utah, 100% of income tax goes to schools. 100% income tax goes to their school program. So their property tax and their sales tax pays everything else in the state. So that's what got me thinking with what if 100% of property tax was, you know, just given to the counties, cities, and schools, and the state lived off of, in our 22 agencies, income tax. So what I'm hearing is we couldn't do that. Income tax doesn't bring in enough money to pay for our agencies, and allowing schools and counties and cities live off of property tax.
Madam Chairman, Representative, I don't know exactly if the numbers would balance out. We know the Entitlement Share Program is north of $200 million with the reimbursements and the gaming and the vehicle money. I don't know what the total number is. Somebody probably has on one of these sheets. We know that the 95 mills is about $300 million a year. And so you got a deficit there that you would have to, if you were going to fund all state programs the same. I mean, you could say, fine, the state's not going to fund, I don't know, the 60% of the K-12 system that it currently funds through income tax and property taxes, natural resource taxes. That's all going to go back to property taxpayers. I mean, I think you could have some staff work those numbers and see what it would happen. I just think that once you looked at where the taxes were going to go up and where they were going to go down, you know, politically you would find that that's probably not a solution you want to do. But I can't tell you for sure that it wouldn't be a trade. I mean, the problem we're always talking about here is the legislature's job is to hold the state general fund, manage that. And they tend to forget that local governments have the same job to fund their operations. They just don't have the sources of revenue that the state does. They have the property tax. And the legislature always wants to keep dabbling in that too. So it's just one of those divisions of labor thing. You need to kind of understand how that works.
And I would add as a additional kind of point for all of us to kind of keep in the back of our minds is that House Joint 35, that interim study, is very much kind of looking at those juxtaposition of that state and local, and those are the issues that are kind of unfolding, and that's happening in the Revenue Committee. So hopefully in January when we're all together, that's the kind of, I think, hope of having that big gathering in January, is that we can sit in on some of that and engage with that Revenue Committee around some of these larger philosophical questions about how we organize this. But I think I have Representative Dunwell next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is for anybody on the committee. Again, I want to make sure I'm on track here and understand what you're telling us. I want to say, I don't think you should be able to steal or freeze money that is the entitlement share, that is money, local funds. Why we don't just call it local source share or something like that. Entitlement has a interesting connotation, but so perhaps in addition to how are we going to put on a suit of armor to prevent the piercing of the entitlement share, probably in addition to that, we could helicopter up a little bit and look at the bigger problem in our legislative process. What allows us to legislate like that without public vetting at the 11th hour when nobody knows about it, and surprise, you find out in the morning? To me, that's a problem with our democracy. So Madam Chair, I would, I don't know if this is the committee to take that up, or if Legislative Council or the Legislative Finance Committee that's looking at the budgeting process would be appropriate. But I would encourage you to talk about that to them. So there was a question here. So your ask to us is making sure this can't be frozen, this can't be changed in any way that it deprives local governments of their money. Similar to, am I correct? Similar to the principle on the coal trust. We can't touch that. Okay, so I guess, is that, so I wonder if you could elaborate on how do we do that? What would legislation look like to do that? And I have a follow-up, if I may.
Pardon me?
And I have a follow-up if there's time.
Okay.
Well, I guess I differ from, I don't know if that's really what this group is asking, that they're asking that this is forever impenetrable. That wouldn't be my ask. My ask would be, if you're going to do it in a thoughtful, logical way that's justifiable. Not just do it because we need some more money to make the general fund balance. Do it because there's a reason to do it. Now, I'm certain from Susan and Tim's perspective that, yeah, it'd be great if it was a constitutional lockdown that, this money was always there and you couldn't take it away with a supermajority. We had a supermajority vote in the bill, but it was just in the bill, so it only took a majority to get rid of the supermajority, and then you could get the money with a majority vote, but we knew that going in, but, that.
And you had a follow-up, I'm sorry, Ms. Nicosia, did you want to respond?
Well, I was going to respond too, because part of the handshake was that supermajority that didn't make it through the legislative process. That the armor was in the original intent as far as cities and counties were concerned. So we know in that handshake, but that is our ask, is that this be protected and that it come through a committee process. We recognize that, yes, we should evaluate over time. Is this the right growth factor? Does this match the intent? But it has to be done. There's a reason that we had 18 of those books before the summary, because it's not simple. And we condensed it, we made it as simple as possible, but there's a lot of moving parts and factors. So now with updating it, it takes time and evaluation and objectivity, and not on the fly, let's freeze this because we want more revenues. So I am asking for a process, protection of this, and I absolutely agree with the name change. And I liked your suggestion, Representative Dunwell.
I think Mr. Burton, and then I think you have one more question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to build off of the responses that you're hearing. And I agree with Mr. Story, we're not asking that this never be reviewed. The members that I represent are very interested in what's in the best interest of the state of Montana and the communities that they represent. And facts change over time. We also know, and you've heard me probably say it many, many times, that we're facing a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deficit, of which the entitlement share is not going to solve. That's the reason why we pursued House Bill 35 with the Revenue Committee this session. Was it's been 20 years since we've done this. Let's do something similar in terms of where the tax base has been, where it is, and where we think it needs to go based upon the best information that we have today. And so we're fully engaged, and I'm sitting on the committee with the Revenue Committee. And we modeled that bill after this process that took place 20 years ago. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. And it includes members of the legislative body, but it also includes folks outside the legislature that have knowledge and business in managing and local governments.
Thank you. And Representative Dunwell, did you have
I'll let the other
any-
one go in the
Okay.
interest of time.
So I think the next person was Senator Malik, and then I have Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I try not to be too wordy here, but I have to say that the mental health cuts were more than mental health cuts. They were, now we have more people in jail, now we have more people in the hospital, now, it's a huge impact to our city and county. And I agree that I was talking to one of the members of the panel before we started that we have voted in our cities for more services, a new jail, a new library, more open space. But they're either essential or they're important to the economic viability of our communities, and we need them. And our communities are important to the economy of Montana. If we don't have them, then we have a problem. I have 4 areas of tax that we probably can't address today, but I'd like you to maybe come back and talk about. And one is new construction. So we have all this new building going on in Missoula, but we can't tax them for some period of time. That's a problem. The corporate tax appeal. I put down $50 and I can appeal my corporate taxes. That's all I'm charged. I might as well appeal. And the business equipment taxes, have we actually studied to see that they've made a difference to our economy? Or are we just doing that and saying, well, that's just what we want to do? Or do we have some evidence that they've actually improved our economy? And of course, the last issue is local option sales tax. We need help in our communities. I will say that people are going to be taxed out of their houses. We just can't keep doing this in our communities, and we need new tax sharing for our local communities. So I don't know that you want to respond today, but those are my issues that I hope we'll address as we move forward.
So does anyone wish to respond? Okay. Senator Asp, did you have your hand up? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Representative Fern.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just reflecting the last interim committee. I'm trying to think of how do we get from what we're hearing to trying to get closer to solving issues before us. And I can think about housing, where we had a couple model bills developed from folks who know housing well. And then we started to vet that process. And though it's later in our time that we deal with solutions, this is such a big, complicated issue. That these 4 folks, 1, 2, 3, 4, have a lot of experience and understand the history of this very well, along with Senator Asp. And so maybe it's worth considering the thought of trying to put together something that would address some of the problems being presented with plenty of time, almost like a working subcommittee that can come back to us and look at okay, how do we deal with the growth factor? I mean, here's how the growth factor works. It's not enough. We're going to make an adjustment. At the same time, we don't know what the interim committee on revenue will be dealing with, and maybe some of it will dovetail. But I think our assignment is to kind of deal with this small entity, relatively speaking, of our budget, and come up with some solutions. So I guess maybe we have a core group of folks who might be able to assist this committee with ideas.
Thank you, Representative, and I think y'all can respond to his thoughts there if you have any. I saw some nods around the fact that we do have a dovetailing process in HJ 35, so we don't want to be stepping on that, but are there some nuggets or some specific pieces that have been alluded to in terms of protecting the entitlement share that makes some sense from this committee without shading into the work responsibilities of the Revenue Committee?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I guess I'd go back to my point that I made a little bit about, this whole program was passed on a philosophy, not on the mechanics. And so, the first point is, does the legislature still support that philosophy that, that policy decisions made at the state level that affect local revenue should be dealt with some way? Reimbursements or whatever. If the state takes over programs as they did, how long is the local obligation to fund those go on? Once they give up control of the program, is that the end of it? So there's those things. So I think this committee just needs to, think about that. So then when some other group gets together and comes with a bill that is counter to that philosophy, do legislators have some knowledge to weigh in and try to, impact that decision? That's hard to do because it's been alluded to here many times. Those decisions are made in the appropriations committees, which are kind of a world unto their own that most of us don't get to participate in and don't get to see what happens behind that curtain. So, I think that's a difficult thing for legislators to do, to stand up with in caucuses or in leadership and say, no, we don't want to go that way because that affects our constituents, our taxpayers. Sure, it's great for the state programs, but what's it do for the... I've said this many times, and I haven't said it in this committee, but, if you think about you as a state legislator and the policy decisions you make, what constituency do you serve? You don't serve the average man on the street. State programs don't touch the average taxpayer. Your constituents are people in prison, people in institutions, people on government assistance. Those are what state programs touch. Medicaid, Medicare. Services to the people that are voting for you are provided by the cities, the counties, and the schools. And so when you decide to fund state programs at the expense of local programs, you're deciding that it's more important to fund these people than it is to fund these people. That's just a decision you make. That's your job as a legislator, but I think you need to understand that so that when you make those decisions, you're allocating scarce resources. Is it more important the state have the money to fund their budget if it takes it away from the local governments that are funding local budgets, whether it be the school, the city, or the county? That's really the decision you're making, and the appropriators that sit on finance and claims and appropriations, they're focused on making the state budget work. The other 80 of you in the House and 30 of you in the Senate, you're focused more on how do you make all these other programs work that come through your individual committees. So I think that's just, a decision individual legislators have to make, and this committee needs to kind of think about is your role as the local government committee. What's your job, to make the state budget work or to help local governments make their programs work?
Thank you, that's very helpful. Senator Esp? Okay, any last words here before this August body sits down? Or
Madam Chair, members of the committee, you've acknowledged and recognized the fact that those of us that were involved in this whole thing are diminishing in numbers. I have no intention of coming back to visit you again. It's not that I don't like you, but I'm really trying to retire. But as fewer and fewer people that were actually involved, the history gets lost, or the history gets modified, worse yet. And so I guess one of the things that I would hope that the committee would do is that you would have a group of you that become educated and understand how this is, so that you can help us tell the story, because somehow we have to transfer that history to the new folks that are taking our place. I would like to close with the first sentence out of the vision statement in Senate Bill 184 that created the committee that had not only legislators but local officials as members of the committee. And it reads, "We are dedicated to a partnership among state, county, city, and school districts that is based on mutual trust and respect for local authority." And I think that's a pretty profound statement.
Thank you, and Mr. Burton?
Madam Chair, I'll just very quickly, I'd like to thank you and the committee. I'm very pleased that you're in existence. It's been couple decades where we've actually had an hour and a half in front of a local government committee. This is, I think, critically important to the institutional memories of your legislative body, but it also allows us to talk at a level of detail with you about policies, opportunities, and challenges that we haven't had for most of my career.
Thank you very much. Ms. Nicosia?
Thank you. I would just say thank you as well. And we'll certainly work with this committee and provide any information and assistance.
Okay, and Senator Esp?
So, Madam Chair, the one thing I was going to point out, and staff can look this up, but so they worked all interim developing a bill and a program, and then we spent many, many nights during the session with another special committee that met to work on mechanics and philosophy and things before we brought it out to the House floor. So you might see how many meetings we had and how long they were. But the point is, I guess, it was a very thoughtful process, and it involved many hands on it and many perspectives. And I think that was what my friend Robert Story Jr. was trying to tell you, and he did it very well.
Representative Fern?
Thank you, Madam Chair. May I ask a question for Senator Esp?
We are past our time, but you may.
For Senator Esp, from what you're hearing and what you just said about all the time put into it, are we heading to something as a committee where we would try, is it appropriate to try some prescriptive measures to correct some of the problems we're hearing about today and we may hear about moving forward, maintaining the same philosophy and sort of a similar structure, but modernizing it or adjusting numbers?
Well, Madam Chair, Representative Fern, I think, number one, you have to decide, is that still a philosophy that we should pursue? And if it is, then how do we mechanically do it that would maybe make it better? Or how can we improve on the mechanics of it? But you have to buy into the philosophy in the first place. And if you do, then we move forward with working on mechanics and adjustments. A lot of things have happened since it was first developed.
And I guess I will take the opportunity to weigh in here as we close this section, which is, I think some of this is conveying in the orientation of our new members and of our existing members, really, kind of the underlying philosophy that drives this, which I think is profound, and I'm not sure that in the mechanics of the growth factor and this flow sheet and that flow sheet and this tax and that tax that got rolled into everything, that we hit that high level kind of commitment that was made in 1999, 2001 in the big bill, and how do we kind of pound that in, if you will, to our current legislative body in a way that helps us kind of continue to maintain that covenant or that handshake that was made back when almost none of us were here. So that's a challenge to me too, and it may not be legislative. It might be a matter of education and inculcation and mentorship and also the culture of this committee. So there are a number of ways we do that. But with that, I would thank you all for your excellent presentation and for the really good feedback, and thanks to the committee for their thoughtful engagement as well.